Have you ever been to Beetleburg? No. But surely you must have stopped in Carrotville? No. Not even once? That's a pity, because that is exactly where the famous Peter Rabbit and his lively, ever-growing family made their home. But wait a moment, which Peter Rabbit are we talking about? This one, or perhaps that one after all? It's easy to get a little lost, but don't fret, we'll sort it out. This small, bright-eyed rabbit in a blue jacket was imagined more than a century ago by the English writer and artist Beatrix Potter. But these two, rounder, older, almost like brothers, arrived soon after, brought to life by an American illustrator. In his time, millions knew him simply as the Peter Rabbit Man. Take a closer look at his drawings. They feel strangely modern, like the pages of a Wimmelbuch, alive with movement, brimming with detail, every corner telling its own small story. And yet, these intricate, bustling scenes were created over 100 years ago, for dozens of newspapers and magazines. And beyond them, countless rabbits, who quietly made their way into American homes over the span of half a century. The future Peter Rabbit Man was born in 1877 in the small New England town of Gardner, Massachusetts, to Edwin and Elnora Cady, who named their boy Walter Harrison. By then, Gardner had already earned a reputation. Since the early 19th century, it had grown into a center of lumber and furniture production. By 1910, 20 factories were turning out nearly 4 million chairs a year. The town proudly carried its nicknames, the Chair City and the Furniture Capital of New England. Meanwhile, in the Cady household, days followed a different rhythm. Walter's father, Edwin Harrison Cady, a town selectman, kept a general store. His mother, Elnora, cared for the family, helped with the business, and quietly nurtured her own love of art. The mercantile stood inside the town hall itself, a place where the everyday bustle of Gardner seemed to gather and unfold. Toys lined up on the shelves. Lemonade was always at hand. No surprise, Walter's friends, and plenty of other children from around town, drifted in and out, never quite in a hurry to leave. And in a way, the store is still there. The building is gone now, but a watercolor painted by Walter himself remains, preserved in the collection of the Gardner Museum. Through it, we step quietly back inside. Here sits Walter's father, absorbed in a newspaper, tucked into the store's book corner, surrounded by some 1,500 volumes. Nearby, his mother tends to a small customer, offering sweets across the counter. And there at the bottom shelf, someone has settled in. Could it be Walter himself? It feels like Christmas Eve. In the opposite corner, two children stand spellbound before the toy display, caught somewhere between wonder and longing. Another darts closer, unable to wait. Laughter spilling into the room like sparkling bells. The question hangs in the air. What treasures might be waiting under the tree? Near the great stove, radiating a cozy, golden warmth, neighbors linger in easy conversation. Dogs curl at their feet, cats stretch luxuriously beside them. And both seem just as much at home here as the people themselves. Above a tall black safe, posters hang, announcing local performances. Tickets sold right here at the counter. Through an open doorway, we glimpse Edwin Cady's office, where, for a time, he also collected the town's taxes. Edwin Cady encouraged his son's drawing from the very beginning. Whenever time allowed, they would walk together, along Betty Spring Road, or beside the still waters of Crystal Lake. The boy sketched constantly, animals, birds, insects, filling pages with observations that would one day return to him in unexpected ways. But more than drawing, his father taught him how to see. He'd keep turning over stones, Cady would later remember, making me observe the life underneath and say, "That's someone's home." He'd point out frogs on lily pads, the beauty of spider webs. It was a way of looking that stayed with Walter his whole journey, the sense that even the smallest, most hidden corners were alive with stories. And then, one day, something remarkable happened. The African explorer, zoologist, and ethnographer Paul du Chaillu came to Gardner to give a lecture. For reasons unknown, he stepped into the small Cady store, and there, quite unexpectedly, found himself staring at his own portrait. Drawn on a sheet of wrapping paper, amid lush jungle greenery, du Chaillu was surrounded by animals of distant lands. The artist was a local boy. Impressed, du Chaillu asked to keep the drawing, and in return handed Walter tickets to his lecture. It was a moment of recognition, quiet but decisive. Soon after, Walter submitted his work to the magazine Harper's Young People, entering a national art contest. He won third prize, along with a diploma for excellence. His hometown, too, had started to take notice. Still a high school student, Walter Cady entered a competition to design Gardner's town seal, and won again. His design remains in use to this day. For it, he received $5, a remarkable sum for the first commission. Walter Harrison Cady never received formal training. Instead, he built his education from what was around him, studying the works of illustrator and writer Howard Pyle, artist, sculptor, and illustrator Frederick Remington, illustrator and political cartoonist William Rogers, illustrator and comic book artist Arthur Frost. He read widely and watched the world with keen eyes, soaking up everything he could from books, magazines, and newspapers. And there was one more figure, Parker S. Perkins. A young artist, mentor, and later a lifelong friend, Perkins became, in Cady's own words, his only true teacher. On a winter day when I was 11 years old, Cady recalled, I trudged through the heavy weather to Parker's house. I quietly took my favorite place in the living room, before the fireplace, and he gave me some pictures to copy. Often I watched my friend at his easel and tried to duplicate with my crayons the subject he was painting. He offered many helpful suggestions. And then, in 1896, with high school behind him and just $13 saved, Harrison Cady left Gardner for New York City. He went with his father's blessing. And with that, a 70-year journey in art gently began. After a train journey from Gardner to New London, Connecticut, the young Walter bought a ticket for a steamer to New York. By morning, he stepped off at the Canal Street Pier, into a city that must have felt impossibly vast. Following a newspaper advertisement, he found a place to stay, the cheapest attic room on 9th Street. A tiny space under the roof. There were no proper windows, only a small skylight cut into the ceiling. Yet beyond that narrow room, the city opened wide before him. As he would later remember, when I arrived in New York, I was at once impressed by the pleasures and opportunities that were to be had on an empty purse in the great city. There were the wonderful museums filled with the wealth of the world. There were the art galleries and the fine shops. The poorest boy could stroll in Central Park and gaze at the fine turnarounds. Yes, New York was for me the land of heart's desire, an inexhaustible treasure house to be explored and possessed. For a time, life was not easy. Walter took on whatever work he could find, stretching every dollar, supporting not only himself, but also his mother, who came to live with him after his father's death. Then, in 1900, something shifted. At 23, he was offered a position as a staff artist at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. It was steady work, but demanding. He drew decorative elements and small cartoons, illustrated news stories. One day it might be a trial, the next a society gathering, or even a dog show. Trying to look the part, he bought himself a slouch hat and carried a walking stick, appearing, at last, like a proper artist. Now he was earning $20 a week. It was enough to move with his mother into a slightly larger apartment in Greenwich Village, though it remained cold and damp. Still, his path was taking shape. Those 4 years, long, busy, exhausting, in all that time he had only 3 holidays left their mark. His hand grew surer, his eye sharper. Cady learned how to work quickly, how to meet deadlines, and people began to notice. This time it was John Ames Mitchell, the publisher and editor of Life magazine. He first bought 3 of Walter's drawings for $90. A few months later, he offered him a position on the staff. At the time, it was one of the most widely read magazines in America, a lively mix of art, humor, and commentary animated by a remarkable group of writers and illustrators. Now among them was Harrison Cady, having set aside his first name, Walter, in favor of his artist's name. What followed was a collaboration that would last 23 years. Years he would later call the happiest of his life. Mitchell, himself both artist and editor, recognized something special in the young illustrator. He admired not only his skill, but the quiet, whimsical way his imagination worked. It was Mitchell who called him a man who saw things that were not there. Cady moved easily among other creative minds. He became a member of the Dutch Treat Club, a lively circle of writers, illustrators, musicians, and actors. But it was in the pages of Life that his imagination found its home. His illustrations appeared often, sometimes on a single page, sometimes across 2, capturing the pressing events of the day. And somewhere along the way, Beetleburg appeared, a place no one had seen, and yet suddenly, everyone seemed to recognize. His colleagues laughed and gave him a nickname, the man who dreams bugs. One reviewer would later write, "Cady is fundamentally a humorist. He is at his illustrative best when there is a twinkle in his eye, and nonsensical fantasies are taking shape on his board." It was his zoological extravaganzas that brought him fame. Cady's cartoons, all his drawings indeed, have been characterized by the most meticulous execution, elaborate scenes, being filled with infinite detail, something going on all over the place. He loved to represent an entire town or countryside alive with insects garbed and acting as foolish as their human prototypes. There was always more to see. A single glance was never enough. In fact, even critics admitted they could spend half an hour studying one of his drawings, wandering through its tiny stories, one after another. Even so, like so much of the work he created for at least 25 magazines and newspapers, thousands of pictures, these images were fleeting. Still, Harrison Cady's art was widely admired. Readers and fellow artists alike saw in him a master of the bird's eye view, not a single scene but dozens unfolding at once across the page. but perhaps his name might have faded, as so many illustrators' names have, if not for something more lasting: books. And one particular partnership that would carry his art into generations of childhoods. It was with Thornton Burgess that something truly enduring began. They worked together and remained close friends for nearly half a century until Burgess's death, and it's easy to see why. Both were Massachusetts natives. Both had grown up close to nature, attentive to its rhythms, its small dramas, its quiet wonders. Burgess wrote about animals with affection and insight. Cady, in turn, gave them form, character, expression, and a world of their own. It was a natural meeting of minds. Cady was not the first illustrator to draw Burgess's characters, but he became the one readers remembered. As Burgess himself wrote with deep gratitude, "The characters I created in text, he visualized and made lovable, each with a touch of that quaint humor in which his gifted pen and brush are ever dipped. His fascinating drawings have had a large part in the popularity of my books." In 1911, the People's Home Journal purchased 3 of Burgess's stories. The first, Danny Meadow Mouse Learns Why His Tail is Short, appeared in the June issue. Harrison Cady was chosen as the illustrator. By then, Cady's name was already familiar to readers, thanks to 15 years of work in magazines, especially Life. Yet this pairing felt special. For Burgess, selecting Cady was a statement. The combination of his stories with Cady's distinctive style immediately captivated him, and hundreds of thousands of readers shared that enchantment. And then came something even more remarkable. In February 1912, little stories for bedtime began appearing. 6 times a week. 6 times a week. While Burgess's words charmed readers, it was Cady's illustrations that opened the stories like windows to a tiny world, filled with warmth, detail, and playful magic. His art became inseparable from the tales, helping make them a daily ritual, and earning Burgess the affectionate title, the Bedtime Story Man. Years passed, and the column continued, eventually renamed simply Bedtime Stories. In total, around 15,000 stories were written, and Cady illustrated nearly all of them. It was he who gave shape to that fantasy world of the whisker-twitching, practical Jerry Muskrat, the slow and steady Jimmy Skunk, the curious, trouble-loving Bobby Coon, the sharp-nosed, ever-scheming Reddy Fox, the tireless Paddy Beaver, the sudden, shadowy Hooty the Owl. One by one, they danced off of the stories and into the imaginations of generations. Harrison Cady made them real. And among them all, one figure stood apart: Peter Rabbit. Of all the illustrators, only Harrison Cady truly captured the character as Thornton Burgess saw him. A clever, sensible little fellow with a spark in his eye. Unlike Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit, this one was a bit more grown-up and thoughtful. At one point, Peter even turned sour on his name. People kept confusing him with the younger English rabbit from across the sea. For a time, he took on a new name, Peter Cottontail. Fortunately, it didn't last long. Readers, and not just the little ones, eagerly awaited each new adventure. Even when Peter played mischievous pranks or tumbled into trouble, he always proved himself loyal and true to his friends. Once a week, Peter Rabbit attended forest school, where Old Mother Nature and other wise teachers explained the habits and quirks of animals, why they looked or acted a certain way, and what made each one special. Little by little, Burgess and Cady's world of characters sprouted and blossomed alongside their readers, and Peter eventually met the charming Miss Fuzzytail, who would become Mrs. Peter Rabbit. through it all, it was Cady's playful, detailed illustrations that made the stories sparkle, turning each page into a small, magical realm where readers could fall in love with Peter all over again. From newspaper columns, the stories made their way into books. Of the 172 books Burgess published, more than half were illustrated by Harrison Cady. Decades passed. By the end of 1959, 85-year-old Burgess and 82-year-old Cady announced that their remarkable journey was complete. In January 1960, the final bedtime story was released, bringing to a close a chapter that had delighted children and grown-ups alike. That same year, Burgess published his autobiography, Now I Remember, his last book. And within its pages, he once again spoke with warmth and gratitude about his friend, Harrison. On August 15, 1920, in the very newspaper that carried the bedtime stories, a new character appeared, Peter Rabbit III. This time, both the story and the drawings were entirely Cady's own. And what a rabbit this new Peter was. Peter Rabbit III had grown older and rounder. He had a cheerful, plump wife named Hepsy and two sons who seemed determined to follow in his footsteps. He lived in Carrotville, in a spacious house, with an impressive wardrobe and even a private car. He attended concerts, costume balls, and belonged quite proudly to a country club. Everything suggested a life of comfort and success. And yet, whatever he did, no matter how harmless it seemed, somehow turned into chaos. A simple drive might end with an entire row of houses knocked flat. A swing of a golf club could send a dozen players scattering. Peter's sons, left alone in a school laboratory, might accidentally blow up half the building. And a furious crowd in pursuit, waving canes, bats, hockey sticks, shouting, "After 'em, boys! We'll fix 'em! Get the villain!" And off they would go again, the hapless family fleeing at full speed, a blur of ears, tails, and comic calamity. Cady stayed with Peter III and his unruly household for nearly 30 years. Every Sunday, a new installment appeared, on top of the 6 bedtime stories released each week. In total, 1,459 episodes. The last was published on July 25, 1948, when Cady, at 70, finally decided to retire. Another artist later tried to continue the series, but something essential was missing. By 1956, those efforts came to an end. Still, Peter's world did not disappear. It spread. Coloring books, cutouts, alphabet books, plates, candy boxes. His characters slipped easily into everyday moments, becoming part of it. Finding my way to the little harbor of Sandy Bay, Harrison Cady once wrote, my eyes became filled with wonder. I was viewing something I had not believed existed in America. Before him lay Rockport, ancient stone docks, small sloops and schooners rocking gently in the water, weathered fishing shacks along Bearskin Neck. Beyond them, the great rocky rise of the headlands covered in wild roses and bayberries. Further still, the open blue of the ocean, and high above gulls wheeled in the wind. I was truly charmed, he recalled. Cady had discovered Cape Ann through his old friend and mentor, Parker S. Perkins, already well known for painting this stretch of Massachusetts coastline. At first, Cady came only for short summer visits. He worked in an unusual studio, a schooner's cabin that had been moved onto a stone dock. One can almost imagine it. The smell of salt in the air, the quiet creak of wood, sheets of paper scattered in the shifting coastal light. But the visits grew longer. Little by little, Rockport grew into another home, Cady called it, with affection, the town of the Great Heart. Harrison Cady's first residence was the Round Tower, a former dye house from a cotton mill, which he had moved to Atlantic Avenue. A year later, in 1920, he purchased the Headlands, a waterfront property overlooking Rockport Harbor and the open Atlantic. There was even a story attached. A local legend told of a 13-year-old boy, Caleb Norwood, who in 1752 discovered buried pirate treasure. With that unexpected fortune, his family built several houses, including the very one the artist now owned. Cady loved telling that story to visitors, and he told it well, for he was, by all accounts, a wonderful storyteller. In Rockport, the ocean unfurled outward without end, and something in that horizon seemed to open equally wide within him. Here, the illustrator continued his work. Sheets filled with the misadventures of Peter Rabbit III, letters arriving from Thornton Burgess, sometimes with new stories about his Peter Rabbit to turn into images, sometimes followed by visits in person. But there was also another side of him, Cady the painter. He began to experiment more freely with oil, with etching. The landscapes around him offered new subjects, yet even these often carried something of his inner world, scenes rich with detail, quietly animated, as though a story might begin at any moment. Winters, he and his wife, Melina, spent in their apartment in New York, at 27 West 67th Street near Central Park. The building, designed for artists, was alive with creative energy. But with the first warm days, Cady returned to Rockport. It was there that he began exhibiting, first at the Gallery on the Moors, later with the Rockport Art Association and the North Shore Arts Association, and eventually, New York galleries turned their eyes to his art. The Macbeth Gallery, Kennedy and Company, the Salmagundi Club. Critics responded with interest and a certain delight. Primarily a draftsman, one observed, Cady uses the brush like a pen. These pictures can be read like a storybook. Another remarked, he illustrates with an almost Dickensian exuberance. Cady's etchings were included in Fine Prints of the Year in 1930. He took part in the New York World's Fair in 1939. And in 1945, his painting Grappling the Lost Anchor received the Edwin Palmer Memorial Award at the National Academy of Design. His works entered important collections, including that of the Library of Congress. He became a member of the American Society of Etchers, the American Watercolor Society. And yet, for all this recognition, it seems he never truly left behind the world he had once drawn into being. Peter Rabbit, Jimmy Skunk, Chippy Chipmunk, Reddy Fox, Billy Possum, Hooty the Owl. And in a way, he stayed with them. People in Rockport remembered him as a gentle, bespectacled neighbor, often seen outdoors with his easel, painting not only landscapes but rabbits, skunks, owls, and now and then, those curious beetlebugs. And if someone happened to pass close enough, quietly, without disturbing him, they might hear him speaking, not to himself, but to his little friends, as if they were, quite simply, part of his world. Walter Harrison Cady passed away in 1970, just 7 years shy of his 100th birthday. One of the last living artists of the golden age of illustration, he left behind a simple request: no solemn farewell, no heavy mourning. Instead, he asked that a memorial service be held in his New York studio, and that those who came should do so with smiles and with joy in their hearts. A tribute, he said, to a man who had lived a supremely happy and wonderful life.